The colonel didn't ask the question gently. He never did anything gently. Colonel Marsh Edelin stood at the front of the room with both hands locked behind his back and his jaw set like poured concrete. And he looked out at the 22 candidates sitting in their pressed uniforms with their fresh haircuts and their brand new confidence. And he said it the way a man says something he already knows the answer to. Not because he wants information, but because he wants to watch you squirm when you don't have it. "Which one of you," he said, "can read a man from 40 feet and tell me whether he's going to pull before he pulls?" The room went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when 22 people suddenly become very interested in the grain of the table in front of them. It was the third week of the Advanced Protective Operations course at a federal training facility in the Virginia Piedmont, and the candidates in that room had been selected out of nearly 400 applicants. They were not ordinary people. Several of them had prior military service, 2 had combat decorations, 1 had a graduate degree in behavioral psychology from Georgetown. They were exactly the kind of people who did not, as a rule, sit quietly with their eyes down. But Colonel Edelin had that effect. He had been running this course for 6 years, and before that he had spent 27 years in federal law enforcement, doing things that still had not been fully declassified, and the gravity of his presence was not the kind you perform or practice. It was the kind that accumulates. You could feel it the moment he walked into the room. This weight of decisions made in dark hallways, of training that had been paid for, not with time but with consequence. He asked the question again. 40 feet, crowded environment. He's wearing a jacket. Left hand is in his pocket. What are you reading, and what are you doing about it? A candidate named Renwick raised his hand. He was 29, former army, squared jaw, and the kind of posture that photographs well. He gave a solid answer. Textbook situational indicators, eye contact patterns, the asymmetry of the jacket. It was the right answer in the sense that it would pass a written exam. Edelin listened without moving. "That's the manual," he said. "I asked what you're reading." Renwick sat back down. The room shifted again. 2 more candidates tried. One gave a longer version of Renwick's answer. The other started talking about micro-expressions and caught herself part-way through, sensing she was drifting somewhere the colonel was not going to follow. Edelin let the silence run. He was not uncomfortable in silence. He was, if anything, more comfortable in it than out of it. He stood at the front of that room like a man who had learned a long time ago that silence is not empty, it's diagnostic. You can learn more about 22 candidates in 30 seconds of silence than in 3 hours of responses, because silence is the only condition under which people cannot perform. He let it run another 10 seconds. Then, from the far corner of the room near the window that looked out onto the parking area and the tree line beyond, there was a sound. Not a voice. A sound, the shift of a chair. And then, slowly, a hand went up. It belonged to a man nobody in the room had introduced themselves to. He was sitting in the last row, against the wall, in a folding chair that someone had added to the room's arrangement as an afterthought. The kind of chair that is never assigned, only occupied by people who arrive early enough to need somewhere to sit and humble enough not to take one of the primary seats. He was wearing civilian clothes, a grey cotton shirt, collar slightly frayed, dark trousers that had been washed many more times than they had been pressed. He had a badge clipped to his belt that no one had looked at closely enough to read. He looked to be somewhere past 70. His hands were the first thing you noticed if you noticed anything. They were the hands of a man who had done physical work for a long time, wide across the palm, with the particular stillness in them that comes not from relaxation but from long-trained restraint. His hair was white, cut short and without vanity. There was a scar along the left side of his jaw that had healed clean a very long time ago. One of the candidates, Taggart, who had been a Marine corporal and had not yet shed the habit of categorizing everyone in a room by whether or not they were relevant, glanced over at him and then looked away. His expression said, maintenance, or maybe facilities, someone who had wandered into the wrong room and hadn't been corrected yet. Colonel Edelin saw the hand. He looked at the old man for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "Go ahead." The old man's voice was not loud. It was the opposite of loud. It was the voice of someone who had learned very early in life that the people who matter are listening, and the people who aren't don't deserve the volume. "You're not reading the hand in the pocket," he said. "You're reading the shoulder." The room shifted. Edelin said, "Keep going. The shoulder on the side of the hand, that's free," the old man said. If a man is about to draw with his right hand, his left shoulder drops first. Fractions of a second, barely visible, but it drops. The body's bracing. The weight is redistributing. The hand in the pocket doesn't tell you anything except that it's in a pocket. The shoulder tells you the decision has been made. No one spoke. At 40 feet, he continued, in a crowded environment, you've got somewhere between 3/4 of a second and a full second between that shoulder drop and the pull. That's not much, but it's enough if you're already moving. He stopped talking. The room stayed quiet for a moment in a different way than it had been quiet before. Not the quiet of avoidance, but the quiet of people resetting around new information. Taggart was staring. Colonel Edelin studied the old man for 3 full seconds. Then he looked out at the rest of the room and said, "Write that down. His name was August Bernard Holloway. No, wait, that name is in the file. His name was Clifford Owen Sears. He had come to the facility that morning not as a student and not as an instructor. He had come because the facilities manager, a man named Dobbins, who had known him for 11 years, had asked him to come by and look at a drainage problem near the East Range that had been causing standing water after rain. Clifford Sears had done some consulting work for federal facilities over the years. Not the kind of consulting that gets written up in procurement documents, but the informal kind. The kind where someone who has seen a lot of things looks at a problem and tells you what it actually is. He was 74 years old. He had arrived at 6:15 in the morning, walked the perimeter of the East Range, identified the issue, a blocked subsurface channel that had been installed incorrectly during a renovation 8 years prior, and written 3 sentences on a piece of paper for Dobbins. By 8 o'clock he was done, but Dobbins had asked him to wait, because there was a second issue on the west side that wouldn't be accessible until a vehicle was moved, and the vehicle wouldn't be moved until 9. So Clifford Sears had found himself with an hour to fill, and he had drifted, the way men who have spent a lifetime in motion tend to drift when they are briefly still, not restlessly, but with a kind of quiet attentiveness, as though the world is always offering something worth noticing if you know how to look. He had found the training room because the door was open and the smell of coffee was coming through it. A support staff member had pointed him to a corner chair before anyone realized the room was about to be used for instruction. By the time the candidates filed in and Edelin took his position at the front, Clifford Sears was already sitting against the wall with a paper cup of coffee and the settled, unhurried quality of a man who has nowhere more important to be. Nobody asked him to leave. Nobody, if they are honest about it, noticed him enough to ask. After the session broke, Edelin came to him. The candidates were gathering their materials, some of them glancing toward the old man in the corner with expressions that had shifted considerably since the beginning of the hour. Renwick was watching him with the particular look of someone who has just recalibrated, trying to reconcile what they see with what they have just heard. Edelin walked to the back of the room and stopped beside Clifford Sears's chair. "Where'd you learn that?" he said. It wasn't an aggressive question. Edelin was not the kind of man who performs aggression when genuine curiosity is what he's feeling. He asked it the way a professional asks another professional, directly, without ceremony, with the understanding that the answer, whatever it was, would be taken at face value. Clifford Sears looked up at him. "Long time ago," he said. "That's not an answer." "No," the old man agreed. "It's not." He set his coffee cup down on the windowsill and looked out for a moment at the tree line and the pale morning sky above it, and something moved through his expression. Not reluctance, exactly, but the particular consideration of a man who has spent so long keeping his own history quiet that speaking it aloud requires a small internal adjustment, like opening a door that has not been opened in some time. "I spent 22 years doing close protection work," he said. "Overseas, mostly, government contract. The kind of work that doesn't have a lot of documentation." Edelin waited. "Before that," Clifford Sears said, "I was Marine Corps, Force Recon. 2 tours in Vietnam, one in places they didn't call anything official at the time." He paused. "The shoulder thing, I learned that the 2nd year. Lost a man the 1st year because we were watching hands. After that, we watched shoulders." The room had mostly emptied. Renwick was still there, standing near the door with his jacket in his hand, not moving. He was listening. He was not pretending he wasn't. Edelin looked at the old man for a long moment. Then he said, "What are you doing here today?" "Drainage problem," Clifford Sears said. "East Range." Edelin almost smiled. "Almost. Could I ask you to stay for the next session?" he said. "What's the next session?" Movement under observation. How to move through a protected principal space without telegraphing your position or your intent. The old man was quiet for a moment. He looked at his paper cup. He looked at the door. "I've got to check on the west side drainage at 9, he said. "It's 8:42, Edelin said. Clifford Sears picked up his coffee cup. He looked at it. He set it back down. "I can stay until 9, he said. He stayed until 11:30. The session on movement bled into a session on environmental reading. How to assess a space before a principal enters it, where the sight lines are, where the vulnerabilities cluster, why a room full of people who look calm can still be dangerous in ways that have nothing to do with any individual person's intent. And in that session, as in the first, Clifford Sears said almost nothing until he said something that mattered. At one point, a candidate named Ostrander, who had a law enforcement background and was technically the most credentialed person in the room after Edelin himself, was explaining her method for assessing entry points, and she was correct in every particular. And Clifford Sears waited until she had finished and then said, very quietly, "You're assessing where people come in. You need to assess where they would go if they needed to leave fast and didn't want to be followed." Ostrander looked at him. "Exits are known," he said. "What you want to know is what someone has decided is an exit that nobody else has thought of yet. That's where you position." She wrote it down. Taggart, who had dismissed him inside the first 5 minutes of the first session, was now sitting slightly turned in his chair so that he could see the old man more easily. He had that look people get when they realize they have been in the presence of something significant without recognizing it, and the recognition itself is a little humbling, and the humility is the correct response. At 11:15, Edelin called a break, and Taggart walked to the back of the room and stood in front of Clifford Sears with his hands in his pockets, and the expression of a man who wants to ask something and is trying to find the least inadequate way to ask it. "What years were you in Vietnam?" he said. 68 through 70, Clifford Sears said. "First tour, second tour was 71, 72, Tet." "I was in Quang Tri during Tet," the old man said. "Different kind of bad than people think. The noise is the thing nobody tells you about. The noise, and then the science after." Taggart nodded slowly. "My grandfather was Quang Tri," he said. "What unit?" "3rd Marines." Clifford Sears looked at him with a different quality of attention. "Good men in the 3rd, he said. "Hard fighters." They were quiet for a moment. Not the awkward quiet of strangers, but something older and less in need of filling. "I didn't think," Taggart started and then stopped. "No," the old man said without any sharpness in it. "Most people don't." It was Edelin who found out the rest of it, and not that day. It was 3 weeks later when a colleague of his at a federal agency returned a call about something unrelated and mentioned, in passing, the name Clifford Sears, and Edelin said, "I know that name," and his colleague went quiet in a way that told him something. "You know him personally?" the colleague asked. "He came through our facility," Edelin said. "Drainage work." There was a pause on the line that was long enough to be its own statement. What Edelin learned over the following days, pieced together from sources that were not all unclassified, and some of which required conversations he will not describe, was this: Clifford Owen Sears had not merely done close protection work. He had spent the better part of 2 decades operating in environments that most people in federal law enforcement and military intelligence work their entire careers hoping they never encounter. He had protected 3 individuals whose names, if spoken in the right rooms, would cause other people to go still. He had been present at moments of consequence, the kind of consequence that shapes the direction of events, without ever appearing in the accounts of those events, because the whole point of the work was to be invisible. He had, on 2 documented occasions and an unknown number of undocumented ones, made decisions under extreme pressure that the official after-action reviews described only in careful, neutral language that nonetheless made clear. People were alive because of him who would otherwise not have been. He had retired at 61, not because he had to, because he chose to. He had not written a book, he had not given interviews. He had a daughter in Roanoke and a small house in the Shenandoah Valley and a kitchen garden that he tended with the same focused attention he had once applied to other things. And a reputation among the very small number of people who knew his name at all. That was the kind of reputation that doesn't need amplifying because it was never diminished in the first place. He had been checking on a drainage problem. He had been sitting in a corner chair with a paper cup of coffee, and nobody had thought to look at his badge. Edelin called him. It took 3 attempts because Clifford Sears did not always answer his phone, not out of avoidance, but out of the settled, self-sufficient quality of a man who spends large portions of his day in a garden and does not carry his phone in his pocket. When he answered, Edelin told him what he had found out. There was a silence on the line. "I don't know what you want me to say to that," Clifford Sears said. "I want to know," Edelin said, "if you'd be willing to come back. Not for drainage." "To do what?" "To talk to them," Edelin said. "The candidates. Not a lecture. Just to talk to them, the way you did in that room." Another silence. Longer this time. "They don't need me to talk to them," the old man said. "They've got you. They've got me teaching them what's in the curriculum," Edelin said. "What you said in that room, about the shoulder, about the exits, that's not in the curriculum. That's the part after the curriculum. That's what 20 years of doing it actually looks like." Clifford Sears was quiet. "They're good candidates," Edelin said. "Renwick, Ostrander, Taggart. These are serious people. But they're young, and they know they're young, and there's a way that knowledge can make you careful in the wrong direction. They're trying to be right. You stopped trying to be right a long time ago and started trying to be accurate. Those are not the same thing." A long pause. "I've got a thing on Thursday," the old man said. "We're not Thursday," Edelin said. "We're Tuesday." "Then I don't have a thing on Tuesday," Clifford Sears said. He came back on a Tuesday in the second week of November, when the leaves had come down from the tree line and the morning had the particular clarity of cold air that has not yet been breathed by enough people to go stale. He wore the same grey cotton shirt. He sat in the same folding chair in the same corner. Edelin introduced him this time. He said, "This is Clifford Sears. He's going to talk to you this morning. I am going to suggest that you listen in a way that you do not always listen, which is to say with the part of you that knows it doesn't know things yet." And then he stepped to the side, and the room looked at the old man in the corner, and the old man looked back at the room. He talked for 2 hours. He talked about a street in Beirut in 1987 where he learned that the most dangerous moment in a protection detail is not the approach but the departure, when the threat that was planning for the approach recalibrates and follows. He talked about a hotel corridor in a city he would not name where he understood, in a fraction of a second, that the man walking toward him was not walking toward him but was walking toward the person 6 feet behind him. And the difference was in the angle of the gaze, which was off by 3 degrees. He talked about 20 years of reading bodies and spaces and the particular quality of stillness that precedes violence. Not stillness like peace, but stillness like a held breath, which is a different thing entirely once you know what to look for. He talked about the men he had worked alongside. He did not sentimentalize them, and he did not exaggerate them. He described them the way a craftsman describes good tools, with respect and specificity and without false emotion, because the respect itself was the emotion. He talked about the ones he had not been able to protect. He said this the way you say something that will not become easier with saying, but that has at least stopped being impossible, plainly, without drama, with the particular gravity of a man who has made his accounting and does not need to perform it for anyone. At one point, Taggart asked him, "How do you not carry all of that with you? All the weight of it?" Clifford Sears looked at him for a moment. "You do carry it," he said. "That's not the question. The question is what you carry it in. If you carry it in the part of you that's trying to prove something, it'll break you. If you carry it in the part of you that just knows what happened and accepts that it happened, it gets heavier over time, but it doesn't get worse." He paused. There's a difference between heavy and worse. It takes a while to learn that difference. Nobody wrote it down this time. Some things you don't write down because writing them down makes them smaller. When it was over, Ostrander came to him and shook his hand and said thank you, and Clifford Sears nodded in the way of a man who accepts thanks without needing it. Renwick came and said, "Can I ask one more question?" And the old man said yes, and Renwick said, "The shoulder thing, have you ever been wrong?" And Clifford Sears said, "Once, 1994. The man dropped his right shoulder and I moved right, and the threat came from his left. I was wrong by 6 inches and got cut along the arm." He pushed up his sleeve and showed a scar that Renwick had not noticed before. "After that I was not wrong again." Renwick looked at the scar. He nodded slowly. "Thank you," he said. Taggart was last. He waited until the room had cleared, and he stood in front of the old man and didn't say anything for a moment, and Clifford Sears waited. "My grandfather's name was Elmore Taggart," he said. "3rd Marines. He never talked about it much either. The old man looked at him. "That's how you know they were there," Clifford Sears said. "The ones who talk about it the most. They were usually in the margins. The ones who went quiet, they were in it. The weight makes you quiet, not because you're broken, because you learned what things actually weigh." He stood up then, collected his jacket from the back of the folding chair, and nodded at Edelin across the room. He walked to the door with the unhurried gait of a man who has been moving through difficult spaces for 50 years and has long since stopped announcing his movements. At the door he paused, and without turning around, he said, not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly, the way a man says his last true thing before he steps outside. "You've got good instincts. All of you. That's not something I can teach you. You either have it or you don't. What I can tell you is that instinct without patience is just reflex, and reflex gets people killed. Slow down the part between what you notice and what you do. Everything worth doing happens in that space." And then he was gone, and the folding chair in the corner was empty, and the room held that particular quality of quiet that falls after something real has moved through it. Not the quiet of nothing, but the quiet of something that has already become permanent, already become part of what these people will carry for the rest of their working lives, already become the thing they will tell their own candidates about, years from now, in rooms that haven't been built yet, about an old man in a grey cotton shirt who came about the drainage and stayed for the only lesson that cannot be written in any curriculum ever made.